This graph represents the three energy systems that contribute to the physiological energy demand when we're exercising. Although we'll be primarily talking about running for this presentation, this graph is relevant for almost any sport where you're physically active for extended periods of time. This first little blip is our creatine phosphate system, which is the smallest contributor. At the start of a race, this is the system that gives you essentially 3 or 4 seconds of free energy, and it's more relevant for short sprinters since they need to accelerate quickly out of the blocks at the start line. The second highest contributor is the glycolytic or anaerobic system. Note that it overlaps with our aerobic system, which means that you're always going to have both working simultaneously rather than one system in isolation and the other. In shorter events, the anaerobic system is a higher contributor than the aerobic system, and we can see the relationship if we look at the x-axis and the y-axis, which denote time and energy contribution respectively. So when we're looking at this graph, it's important to understand two simple ideas. One, your anaerobic system and your aerobic system are both going to be important in the middle distance events, which will generally be around 2 minutes and 6 minutes. You can't just rely on one or the other. They're both going to be active at once. The second idea is that the longer the race event is, the more aerobic you become. Some people say that if the race goes longer, you go into oxygen debt, quote unquote, and become anaerobic. But that's plainly wrong. For girls, because they end up with longer finish times, their physiological profile in general is going to be more aerobic because their finish times are farther along the x-axis. For boys, it's the inverse, because as you end up getting faster, you end up with a higher anaerobic percentage as the average times get better. This second chart is the plotting of data, just looking at the aerobic contribution. Again, just looking purely at the aerobic system, we can see that the relative contribution becomes higher and higher as the event goes longer. If we were to extend this x-axis to 2 hours, the aerobic system contribution will continue to climb even higher and higher as the event goes longer. This chart I've gone over a few times, but again, this is training in a nutshell. When we look at your performance, your training acts as a stimulus, and that stimulus is embarrassment and damage to your body. Thankfully, our body is adaptive. So even though we take a hit in performance after a workout, if we recover, meaning we sleep and eat and rest and etc., we get what is called a supercompensation, which is a bump in our fitness. However, over time, we end up losing these beneficial adaptations, which means we have to train consistently, repeating this virtuous cycle over and over again. This is an imaging of muscle tissue from high school runners after a training session. We see on the left what muscle tissue should look like when we're well rested. They're cords of tissue weaved together. But after a hard training session, they're torn and damaged. But that's okay, because with proper recovery, the body will repair these torn fibers and make them tougher and stronger. What I want to emphasize when we're looking at this imaging is that going back to the idea of supercompensation, training only works if we understand that not only do we have to create the damage through workouts, we also have to recover from that damage. There is no instant offense without that recovery. When we examine training for distance events, there are 4 major categories that I look at when we think about supercompensation and what specifically the training is looking to improve. The first one is the most important for endurance events, including swimming, cycling, cross-country skiing, and running. I've highlighted the term mitochondrial biogenesis, but it is self-explanatory. Mitochondrial meaning mitochondria, and biogenesis meaning biological, and Genesis, which you can think of as the first book in the Bible, Genesis, or Greek for origin. So the creation of mitochondria. how much quantity of mitochondria you're able to create within your body. We also have specific qualities for the mitochondria that we're trying to train as well. Lactate shuttle gets extremely complicated, but I'll note that because distance events are aerobically dominated, we have to acknowledge the importance of mitochondrial function because these subcells are responsible for powering the aerobic system, which is the dominant energy system. The second category is muscle fiber development, and this one is somewhat self-explanatory, and I'll go over more of this in a little bit. The third category refers to neurology, which is a neglected component of training for distance runners compared to the other two. Sprinters and highly coordinated team sports, which emphasize skill and dexterity, will pay more attention to the neurological factors, but they are very much relevant for distance runners as well. It's not enough to have just a great aerobic system or have a lot of well-developed muscles. You also need to have a powerful and well-trained signaling mechanism from your brain through your spinal cord and to your muscles to help coordinate muscle contractions and force production. Lastly, this fourth category, I actually spend the least amount of time worrying about, but it is the cardiovascular system. This refers to your heart, your blood, and how it travels through your body through the veins and capillaries. Consistent training will help develop heart tissue muscle and help enlarge your veins and capillaries so more blood is able to travel more efficiently through your body. Your blood itself will be more dense with blood cells and have a more interesting mix of plasma and other stuff related to physiology. Here we have an overview of the muscles used when running. I'll note that the upper body plays a role as well indirectly through neurology. 800-meter runners specifically, your upper body muscle tone and development is as important as your lower body strength and conditioning. We also have a look at what muscle fibers look like, and again, they're cords. They're strings of tissue bound together. I brought up these two dogs in an earlier presentation this season, but to recap, on the left is Westy the Greyhound, and on the right is Enzo, a lab mix. Greyhounds are sprinting dogs, and they have a lot of what we call type 2 muscle fibers. They're race dogs, which in some parts of the US you can gamble on. Enzo on the right, he recently completed a 40-mile race and has a lot of type 1 muscle fibers, which are necessary to complete large distances. Type 1 muscle fibers are the two images at the top, and they're called slow twitch because they contract relatively slower. On the bottom are type 2 muscle fibers, also called fast twitch because they contract far faster than type 1 muscle fibers. Type 1 muscle fibers, they have a lot of value in distance events because they fatigue slower. And when you train these fibers well, you're better suited to withstand a long time running. Type 2 muscle fibers, on the other hand, are associated with speed and power output functions. If you have a lot of type 2 muscle fibers, you can be quite a bit faster in terms of pure speed, but the downside to these fibers is that they're glass cannons. They tire and fatigue easily. In the middle is what is called type 1.5 muscle fibers. These are type 1 muscle fibers that have adapted to the training loads and have taken on characteristics of the type 2 muscle fibers. They won't be quite as powerful or efficient as pure type 2 muscle fibers, and they are susceptible to converting back to type 1 fibers without consistent training. However, they're a good example of the effects of targeted training and producing meaningful adaptations. Here we have a spread of average distribution of overall muscle fibers in different sports. So this is a generalized chart, and individual athletes will all have their own muscle typology based on their genetics and training profile and training history. Triathlon and long distance running have a lot of overlap, which makes sense when you think of just the time horizons of a triathlon and a long race, like a 10K or a half marathon, compared to an Ironman. Interestingly, middle distance running and soccer actually have more overlap than soccer and long distance running. But if you think about what actually occurs in a soccer game, it's around 90 minutes of activity. However, a fair amount of that time isn't actually running, right? You also have to consider that when there is activity in a soccer game, it's a lot of bouts of explosive action. This slide I stole from another presentation, but the idea presented is very simple and one that is a big part of how I think about training. Not only am I worried about the aerobic system, which is a big factor in distance events, I'm also thinking in terms of muscle fiber recruitment. How much are we training all of these muscle fibers and having our body practice using them? If you only do a certain type of training, you leave muscle fibers off the table. For example, a program that only features a lot of high mileage and a lot of long, slow running will mainly train those type 1 muscle fibers in a certain way. But if the goal is to race a fast 5K, you're going to have a certain percentage of type 2 muscle fibers which are not only underdeveloped, but the brain is not well versed in utilizing them, which goes to the neurological component I mentioned earlier. Training for races is a balancing act between two factors: speed and endurance. When I think about speed, the big question in my mind is, how long are we able to express speed? It does no good to be very powerful and very fast if someone can only keep that up for a few seconds, versus the total race time, which can vary from 2 minutes to 20 minutes, depending on what race we're competing in. When I think about endurance, I think of it in terms of fatigue in a race. And I want to emphasize that I am not thinking in terms of overall endurance. I'm thinking about in an actual race. How are you able to deal with combating the different types of fatigue that hits you in the course of a race? Fuel and resource depletion is a more significant factor in major road races like a half marathon or a full marathon distance. This is basically just running out of blood sugar or glycogen in your muscle fibers and liver. For the high school distances, this isn't as big of a deal, but it is something that has to be developed in order to train better. Training to train. Oxygen scarcity is something that is a bigger deal in longer events. But again, each race you're going to have this limitation emerge. I put in parentheses cardiac drift, and this refers to your heart rate increasing significantly in order to deal with the strain of a race, in order to get more oxygen to your blood muscles, to your muscles. This is a much bigger deal in road races, but obviously in a mile or a 5K, you'll have this jump occur in heart rate in the same sort of pattern in each distance event. Muscle fiber fatigue is a useful concept to acknowledge. As we saw earlier in the presentation, muscles aren't solidly uniform. They're strands and cords. So as we tear through these muscle fibers, they fatigue and become sort of useless or limited in their ability to contract. So having a high quantity of muscle fibers is important. As well as qualitatively, we want to have those muscle fibers be more resistant to literal wear and tear. Neural fatigue refers to the neurological signaling, and this is a real factor in distance races. You can often see it when people's forms give out and their legs and their arms look sloppy. This is not only just because of muscle fiber fatigue, but it's also neurological fatigue because their brains and their nervous system haven't been properly trained to handle that strain late in a race. The signaling becomes weak as they fatigue. Lastly, acidosis. This refers to lactic acid accumulation, which I don't really want to go through because it gets very complicated again. But to summarize, in short, in races, your blood will get more acidic as you go on, and that ruins the pH balance your body prefers to function correctly. If you don't train to deal with this, not only is it going to really suck for you, if you are very undertrained in this aspect, you'll end up vomiting as a way to get rid of that poison that accumulates in your bloodstream. I said earlier in the presentation that we have two major energy systems that contribute towards distance races: the aerobic system and the anaerobic system. In terms of training, however, we have subcategories of capacity and power. We have our aerobic capacity and our aerobic power. And we have our anaerobic capacity and our anaerobic power. The problem that coaches and athletes will run into is not acknowledging that there is a distinction between these subcategories, between capacity and power training. It is distinct and it will lead to different outcomes. So this information is taken from swimmers, but the physiological profile is the same when we are examining energy systems and how they train capacity and power. Your aerobic capacity, I will define as your ability to train well for an extended period of time. We can also conceptualize it as your basic cross-country conditioning. Your aerobic power is the ability to utilize the aerobic energy system. So what you're actually capable of doing in a distance race at race pace. Your anaerobic power is what I will define as your pure speed, which is largely unrelated to the aerobic capacity and aerobic power in terms of training. You can do a lot of 10-mile runs, but that's not going to really help your sprint that much. Anaerobic capacity is the hardest to define, but it's essentially how good you're able to run a 400-meter race. It is speed that is forced to extend beyond the typical time horizons. Please note that even though this whole page is very technical, each thing, capacity and power, aerobic capacity, aerobic power, anaerobic capacity, anaerobic power, each thing will affect the other. Going back to the car visual, it's a good metaphor for the relationship that occurs between these subcategories. Power is useless without capacity. You can have a very high aerobic power, a very strong engine, but if your anaerobic capacity is weak, you won't be able to express it that well. Your engine will sputter out after 2 minutes of running. Conversely, if all you do is aerobic training, a lot of mileage, but you don't work on utilizing that aerobic system at race paces, you'll have a very weak output despite having great overall endurance. Anaerobic capacity and power will also follow this relationship. The bigger point I will make here is that even though this information is very technical, all 4 components here contribute to your overall physiological makeup. We can't just do one type of training. We have to train multiple things here. The art of coaching is determining how to target each of these things. How much of these things does someone need in their training cycles? And most importantly, assessing when the training has gone wrong and is over-indexed in the wrong aspect. Going back to the very first slide, the long distance events are the easiest to train for because the energy contribution is simple. A 3-mile race or 5K race will generally be around 90% aerobic or more. So all you really need to do is train up a lot of the aerobic capacity and power and throw in maybe a little bit of the anaerobic work. If you were to train for a marathon, you would do very close to little anaerobic capacity and anaerobic power training in general. There would still be some value outside of the physiology, but you'd mostly be doing aerobic work. The problem with the middle distance events is that we are in this weird purgatory, so to speak, of energy contribution between aerobic and anaerobic. The mile is hard to train for because even though the majority is aerobic, over a quarter of that energy contribution is anaerobic. The 800 meter is even trickier because it's divided nearly half and half. I often call it the long sprint, and some people don't even define this event as a true distance event. So in comparison for training for the longer events like the 5K, you can't just favor a lot of basic endurance training and some aerobic power training. You have to have a mix of training. And this isn't even considering what athletes you're working with. Different athletes will bring to the table different things. Some athletes will individually favor and respond better to certain types of training, depending on their muscle fiber typology, their individual training history, and their personal preferences. In the real world, training is tough because as we saw in the earlier chart, you can't train in isolation with just one aspect. Any type of workout will have multiple training effects. This slide refers to the training session we saw earlier with high school athletes, an interval workout of 5 times 500 meters. In real world terms, they're probably running closer to race pace than their basic runs. In terms of physiology, this workout would be meant to work on both anaerobic capacity and anaerobic power. But the problem that is noted here is that when lactate levels were high, as in they ran much faster than they should have in training, and their blood accumulated a lot of poison and it got very acidic, that high level of exertion killed off some of their mitochondrial population, meaning that their aerobic capacity takes a hit from this training session. These runners should still get a net benefit from this training session overall, but we should note the reality of consequences here. So zooming out and looking at the big picture, I want to summarize some key points. 1. The aerobic system is the dominant energy system that we want to work on and train on in general in both cross country and track. 2. We can't just ignore, however, the anaerobic system. If we are in cross country season, we should be working on the anaerobic system a little bit, but not so much because it's not as big of a factor. For the middle distance, however, in track, we have to figure out the right balance, and that gets complicated. The third and most important point, we have to work on our capacity before worrying about race paces. We have to train to train. And for endurance sports, frequency is more important than intensity. Training often and working on our capacity is more important than dying every single practice at a very high intensity or speed. If you are working too hard and going over your limit in individual sessions, you increase the risk of injury over minimal rewards. No one single training day is going to be as important as weeks and months of consistent training.